In this parking lot, in November of 1974, Mitchell Herman, an agent of the Church of Scientology, tuned in on an FM radio to a special frequency. Hours earlier, he had bugged the offices of the IRS. He was listening intently to a meeting regarding the Church of Scientology and the millions of dollars of back taxes they owed the IRS. Mitchell is just one operative in a far-reaching conspiracy by the Church of Scientology. This conspiracy would not only see operatives infiltrating the offices of governments across the globe, but also controlling every piece of information regarding the church that those agencies could possess. This plot didn't stop at infiltration, but extended into orchestrating murder and framing key government officials. A deep cover mission that was so far-reaching, some believe operatives are still in play as high as Capitol Hill. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is public record conspiracy fact.
The Church of Scientology.
Some call it a manipulative cult.
Next stop, infinity.
Take me there.
The controversial Church of Scientology.
These are the times we will all remember.
Others say it's a well-established religion that helps people reach their potential. Since its inception in the 1950s, the Church of Scientology has rarely been far from controversy.
You don't know the history of psychiatry. I do.
If you give them all your money, they'll make anything possible in your life.
Welcome back to Dark Frontier, the largest scale infiltration of the US government in history by the world's most secretive religion. Operation Snow White saw over 5,000 operatives embedded in over 136 different agencies and organizations across 30 countries. Snow White's actual period of operation was only a few short years, but the full scope of the Church of Scientology's insidious plot spanned decades, from the late 1960s to the turn of the century, and possibly beyond. But first, what led up to this? It all started in 1950, when author L. Ron Hubbard first created the pop psychology phenomenon Dianetics, which spread like wildfire. Dianetics evolved over time into Scientology proper. There are some excellent videos on the origins of Scientology linked in the description, but everything you need to know is in the name. Scientology, religion or cult, is meant to seem scientific. Scientology's core beliefs, aliens, the Thetan race, Xenu, etc., was hidden behind this front of an innocuous, scientifically grounded life philosophy. This couldn't have been further from the truth. As a religion, Scientology eventually received a tax-exempt status from the IRS in 1956. The jig was up by 1958, when the IRS realized that Hubbard and his wife were directly profiting from the church's income. The exemption was revoked, setting in motion an irreversible chain of events. The church was also getting heat from the FDA for fraudulent medical claims. That same year, the FDA would seize 21,000 of the church's Dianazine tablets, cure-all pills marketed as a cure for radiation sickness and poisoning, which were really just vitamins. L. Ron Hubbard would go on to declare the FDA the enemy, and also blame President John F. Kennedy for waging a war on religion. In 1966, the church decided they wouldn't take it anymore. L. Ron Hubbard formed the Guardian Office with the explicit directive of protecting Scientology's interests. Soon there were Guardian offices all across the US. The body was made up of 5 bureaus, including, most importantly, the Information Bureau, of which L. Ron Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, was the Commodore Staff Guardian, the highest possible rank under L. Ron Hubbard himself. On April 20th, 1973, L. Ron Hubbard writes a directive, Guardian Order 732. This order goes to his wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, who places it in the hands of a Jane Kember, the Church of Scientology's spy master. Kember immediately hires Henning Helt and a curated staff of spies to infiltrate none other than Interpol. And what is the directive of GO 732? To target and remove erroneous files regarding the Church of Scientology. Then came Guardian Order 1361, a directive giving Kember the authority to infiltrate the IRS offices in Washington, D.C., the IRS embassy offices in London, and the Department of Justice, DEA, National Institute of Mental Health, American Medical Association, and even the Coast Guard. The order now includes not just removing information, but correcting it. October 21st, 1974. Operation Snow White officially begins. A man named Michael Meisner is appointed Assistant Guardian for Information in the District of Columbia. His responsibilities include the implementation of all Information Bureau orders, programs, and projects within the DC area. Meisner's supervisor at this time is Duke Snyder, the Assistant Guardian for DC, the highest rank in the DC Guardian office. Meisner and new recruit Gerald Wolfe are soon employed as typists at the IRS, where they fatefully discover that the IRS is holding a meeting to discuss the Church of Scientology, which has been attempting to become a tax-exempt church once again, but is facing scrutiny for failing to pay several million in back taxes. In November 1974, co-conspirator and Information Branch Director for the church, Mitchell Herman, somehow manages to, as a U.S. District Court would later describe, surreptitiously enter the IRS office building and bug the room. He then tunes into the meeting via FM radio in the Smithsonian parking lot next to the IRS offices. Then, throughout the month of December 1974, Wolfe, Herman, and Meisner break into several attorneys' offices within the IRS and compile a collection of files 20 inches thick that gets sent up the chain of command to L. Ron Hubbard himself. Over the course of the next 7 months, from January to July of 1975, the operatives spread, and this trio of Scientology spies works harder than ever, breaking in and out of offices and collecting documents. That year, a woman named Sharon Thomas infiltrates the U.S. Coast Guard Intelligence Division because the church has been a target of theirs. The church, you see, has a naval fleet called the Sea Org, which acts as their missionary service abroad, traveling from country to country to infiltrate their ports and, with or without permission, spread the good word. Another woman, Nancy Douglas, also infiltrates the DEA at this time. By now, the Church of Scientology has agents everywhere. The church is ready to strike. In May of 1975, Scientology launches a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against the IRS. How does this play into their plan? Well, they actually set quite a clever trap. Using stolen government letterheads from the compromised IRS offices, the church circulates their own confidential financial information within the IRS and leaks it to various newspapers, posing as a disgruntled IRS employee, making the IRS seem incompetent, and to essentially bully their way into achieving the church's tax-exempt status. This is Charles Zaravin, an IRS lawyer who would be defending the IRS during the case. Charles would unintentionally do the Scientologists' jobs for them and hand-deliver them a treasure trove of information. Here's how. Wolfe, the Scientologist agent, revealed to his superiors that Zaravin was preparing an index of Scientology files relevant to the FOIA case, and his office was added to the hit list by Meisner and the other agents. IRS offices from all over the country were sending files to Zaravin. This index file, required by the courts in all FOIA cases, is a list of all the documents requested, and in most cases accompanying legal grounds making the case for each file's confidentiality. By October, Zaravin had finished the index, numbering each document in order to simplify filing, and had provided a copy to the church's attorneys. These attorneys, in turn, gave the index to Raymond, who passed it along to Meisner, who passed it to Wolfe. Wolf then gained entry to Zeravin's office and began copying every document listed on the index. By January 1976, Herman informed Meisner that Henning Helt and an accomplice named Richard Weigand had approved a plan to send Don Alverzo, the Information Branch Director, to Washington, D.C. to infiltrate the Department of Justice with Wolf's help. The Church's goal now was to infiltrate agencies that had either advanced knowledge of impending subpoenas or the power to issue them directly. Wolf, Alverzo, and Meisner infiltrated the Department of Justice offices in Washington, D.C., and were there until 3 a.m. While there, Wolf and Meisner managed to make fake IRS ID cards, which they could later use to gain access to the restricted section of the federal courthouse in D.C. for even more documents. It was all going rather swimmingly until one of the offices was locked. To make matters worse, as they were attempting to enter, a cleaning lady had spotted them. Thinking this group of Scientologists at 3 a.m. looked awfully suspicious, she called security, which came quickly. Intruders in the IRS is a fairly big security breach. That's when the security guard was presented with their IDs. Wolf presented his real one and Meisner's fake one. The guard studied them closely, glancing at the cleaning woman and the two operatives. Finally, he let them walk right in. Once inside, the agents got their hands on the right documents, but there was no photocopier. So the two men simply took armfuls of files into the main IRS building, then back to the office, and this back and forth went on for about 4 hours, right under everyone's noses, in the dead of night. Wolf and Meisner would go back to their regular IRS duty, but Mary Sue Hubbard wanted more. She wanted infiltration of every government agency that had withheld files from the church. So, in May, Wolf broke into the U.S. courthouse and stole the keys to the office of Assistant U.S. Attorney Nathan Dowdle. Wolf managed to duplicate the keys and return them unnoticed. 3 weeks later, Wolf and Meisner broke into Dowdle's office and stole documents before once again sending them up the food chain. Dowdle, you see, had gotten on the church's radar thanks to a Scientology FOIA case in April, where a judge had asked him whether the U.S. had considered a deposition of L. Ron Hubbard. Dowdle, unfortunately for him, stated that it was an interesting thought, and he promised to discuss it with the DOJ proper. You can imagine how well that went over with the church. At the end of the month, Meisner and Wolf went back to the courthouse, signed in to do research in the library, and were issued an elevator key. They rode the elevator to the library floor and were in the room long enough to grab several books and find a table to study. After a few minutes, they snuck through the back door and emerged into the hallway where Dowdle's office was and entered using the cloned keys. They snagged all of the Scientology pertinent documents and, once again, found some photocopiers. But should always be cautious not to upset librarians. The duo would come back for more documents, signing in under fake names and gathering files on the Washington, D.C. Police Department as well as the FDA. To cap off the night, they figured they would return to Dowdle's office, where they were stopped by the librarian. He asked if they had signed in. They had, technically, at the front desk of the courthouse building, but not the library. The librarian, Johnson, told them to leave and not come back unless they were signed in, or if they had specific authorization from the day librarian. 3 days later, Johnson notified the U.S. Attorney's Office that the two had been using the photocopier in their offices. Johnson was told to contact the FBI if the duo ever returned. And return they would, less than 2 weeks later. Mitchell Herman phoned Meisner and ordered him to return to Dowdle's office to retrieve his personnel files, as part of a scheme that would have Dowdle removed as U.S. Attorney for good. Meisner and Wolf entered the courthouse on June 11, 1976, at around 7 p.m. Again, Johnson rushed to stop them, but the two had come prepared. They had a letter from the day librarian. The two continued to Dowdle's office, but it was being worked on by the nighttime cleaning ladies. As the two were waiting for the ladies to finish, they were interrupted by the two FBI agents that Johnson had rang. The two somehow managed to talk their way out of trouble again, or so they thought, After the incident with the FBI, the two told Herman they had been caught and were ordered immediately to return to Los Angeles. Meisner and Wolf were given cover stories by the Guardian's office, and at the end of June, Wolf was arrested and charged with the use and possession of a forged official pass. After processing and interrogating Wolf, the FBI began to connect the dots, and it became clear that Wolf and Meisner were not just simple rogue agents. As the Church of Scientology waited to see what would happen with the arrested Wolf, they put his accomplice Meisner, who had been released by the FBI, into hiding. Hiding is one word for it anyway. In reality, Meisner found himself in the middle of another, darker conspiracy, a plot for his own assassination. Meisner was now being held by the church and bussed from one LA motel to the next, sometimes more than twice a day, all to elude the FBI. Finally, Meisner got tired of running and made a mistake he'd live to regret. He threatened to return to Washington and turn himself in, just to have the chase ended and a chance of a normal life. You can probably assume how well that went over. While he may not have been happy with his previous accommodations, his new ones were less comfortable. Meisner was quickly put under the church's watch and would be routinely gagged and handcuffed to make sure he didn't escape the custody of his bodyguard crew. This is Marjorie Wakefield, a Scientology whistleblower who wrote the tell-all book The Road to Xenu. In the mid-1970s, she had just been forgiven by the church for her past indiscretions and put into the public division. She described the time as enjoyable, but recognized that she was simply engaged in a new form of propaganda. Overseeing an Easter egg hunt held for children, entertaining the elderly, cleaning parks, but she had no idea what was coming. Wakefield was given the task by her superior of combing through any and all documents the church had on Meisner so they could blackmail him for threatening to go to the FBI. I was told to be particularly alert for any information regarding sexual deviance or criminal behavior. I had to circle anything I found in red ink and tab the page. One day, Wakefield's Guardian Office superior called her into a meeting. Dozens were assembled around a large table with timelines for the church's various targets spread out before them. A timeline, according to Wakefield, was a person's entire life arranged in chronological order. That's when her superior, Dick, spoke. "We have a problem. Meisner is threatening to leak this whole project to the FBI. And not only this project, but any other Guardian Office project he knows about." The other project Meisner was threatening to leak was Operation Freakout, an attempt to target an author named Paulette Cooper and frame her for a bomb threat to the church. The church's vendetta against Cooper was severe enough, but what Dick suggested next sent a chill down Wakefield's spine. "We can't afford a serious leak of this nature," Dick said. "We need a permanent solution to this problem." Meisner was under Scientology's watch, his location changing so fast that only the organization's top brass seemed to even know where he'd be at any given time. Then the reality of the situation began to set in. The church already had him. They could do anything they wanted to with him. A few around the table spoke. "Where is he now? Do you have a plan?" Dick replied, as if waiting for someone else to say it for him. "What would you suggest?" Then, before anyone could answer, he continued, "Remember, Scientology is the only hope for this planet, and this one man has the potential to destroy it all. He has the ability to destroy everything." The unspoken solution seemed to have been agreed upon. Meisner would have to be silenced for good. Wakefield was racked with guilt for having been in that meeting, for being part of a plan to permanently silence a man, for being a threat. Shortly after that, though, Meisner escaped, after earning the trust of his guards at the motel. Meisner had avoided his own impending death, and made his way into FBI custody, where his information would set in motion an irreversible chain of events. With Meisner's information, the FBI raided the church's locations in LA, Hollywood, and Washington, D.C. with 156 agents, the most ever used for a single raid. The raid went on for 21 hours and furnished enough evidence to completely fill a 16-ton truck. The raid and subsequent findings exposed several illegal activities that the church had carried out during Operation Snow White, and resulted in the indictment and imprisonment of 11 powerful Scientologists, including L. Ron Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard. While Meisner and the FBI brought a fiery end to the church's Snow White project, a troubling question came to light in the decades following. Did the church really lose? Was the church done with its subterfuge? Was Snow White really over? Directly following the raid, the IRS did place a lien on Scientology's LA headquarters. In response, the church fired back to appeal against the IRS's tax assessment for the years of 1970 to 1972. To show the IRS that they were a better organization in the wake of Snow White, the church's Guardian office underwent a major restructuring into the Office of Special Affairs, making their new administrative layout purposefully confusing. The church's revision of history would begin soon after, when Elaine Siegel, a program chief within the Office of Special Affairs for the church, corresponded with the IRS and titled herself Snow White Programs Chief, overseeing the Snow White Unit. Of course, the IRS questioned Scientology's previous claim that Snow White had been disbanded. The church's response was that Snow White was now just a fact-checking team. According to the church, Snow White was just a very particular name now for the legal pursuit of information. The true nature of this legal pursuit of information was later uncovered by the New York Times in a 1997 article showing that the Church of Scientology had gone on to hire several private investigators to dig into the lives of several senior-level IRS officials. Michael Shomers, for example, was a PI working for the church from 1990 to 1991, and to obtain his information, he worked under the guise of a phony operation called the Washington News Bureau, where he would pose as a reporter and gather information on church critics. Posing as press, he would attend IRS conferences and gather all the information he could on IRS members who might be having affairs, skipping meetings, or anything at all the church could use as ammunition. And then, despite all of this, something truly puzzling happened. A war that had been waged for over 30 years came to an end after a secret meeting between IRS Commissioner Fred T. Goldberg Jr. and David Miscavige, who was then the de facto head of the organization. Miscavige, allegedly, offered to drop all legal suits against the IRS if the church were given tax exemption. Goldberg, shockingly, coalesced. A special group would be created within the IRS under Special Agent Howard M. Schoenfeld. This agreement and special group completely bypassed the IRS's internal structure, as well as many rules and regulations. Somehow, for some reason, the IRS, one of the most stringent organizations in the US government, the downfall of such criminals as Al Capone, which had been in battle with the church for decades, agreed to the church's demands. Maybe all the church had needed all along was a fresh face. Furthermore, the bulk of the church's financial details, as well as the specifics of that meeting and of the nature of the church's special relationship with the IRS, were to be sealed off completely. In June of 1992, the U.S. Claims Court would uphold the IRS's long-standing denial of tax exemption. 1 year later, in August of 1993, the IRS would grant tax exemption to every Church of Scientology entity within the U.S., including foreign agencies in the UK and Cyprus. At that time, within the IRS, 2 tax analysts wrote internal memos instructing agents to ignore, quote, substantial issues reviewing the exemption documents. Then, in October of the same year, the IRS formally announced the exemptions for over 150 entities, including the publication of L. Ron Hubbard's new book. As a charitable activity, the IRS declared the agreement with the church secret, despite their legal obligation to disclose it under the Internal Revenue Code Section 6104. to disclose any and all information submitted to the IRS by tax-exempt organizations. The Consumer Affairs Group tax analysts would submit a FOIA request to gain the specifics of this secret agreement, which the IRS simply denied. Well, that went over about as well as you'd expect. The tax analysts filed a lawsuit. The U.S. District Court for Washington, D.C. would order the IRS to release their documents. Then, in December of 1997, the secret agreement leaked to the Wall Street Journal. The IRS declared that someone had leaked it maliciously and placed blame on a Scientology watchdog group called Alt-Religion. IRS officials insisted that Scientology's tactics had not affected the decision, and some officials acknowledged that ruling against the church would have just prolonged a fight that had already consumed extensive government resources and exposed officials to personal lawsuits. At one time, the church and its members had more than 50 suits pending against the IRS and its officials. The Church of Scientology marked their tax exemption as cause for celebration and expansion. 4 months after the exemptions were granted by the IRS, the State Department released something interesting. Its influential Human Rights Report for 1993, a litany of the countries that abuse their citizens. Along with the usual suspects, for the first time the report contained a paragraph noting that Scientologists had complained of harassment and discrimination in Germany. Using this backing by the US government, the Church of Scientology would carry themselves as an officially recognized and protected group of people. So what did the private investigators find on these IRS agents? And what was discussed in the secret meeting between the church and the IRS that took place completely off anyone's record? What other powerful entities have bent the knee to Scientology after all these years? Was Project Snow White a success?